Laura stood on the small flower-adorned dais, her hand held firmly in David's, and felt a wave of pure, unadulterated happiness wash over her. At 55, she had not expected this. After the slow, painful dissolution of her first marriage and the subsequent years spent single-mindedly raising her daughter, Chloe, she had resigned herself to a life of quiet independence. Her work as a landscape architect was her passion, her gardens were her children, and her carefully ordered life was her sanctuary. She had believed the grand romantic chapters were over, relegated to the past. Then David, a charming silver-haired literature professor, with kind eyes and a laugh that seemed to fill any room, had walked into her life and had, with a patient, gentle persistence, convinced her to write a new one. The setting for this new chapter was perfect, a symphony of her own creation. They were getting married in the heart of the Philadelphia Botanical Garden, in a secluded, walled rose garden that had been one of her earliest and most beloved projects. The late afternoon sun filtered through the leaves of ancient oak trees, casting a dappled golden light on the faces of their closest friends and family. The air was thick with the heady scent of 1,000 blooming roses, a fragrance she had always associated with new beginnings. David's vows were beautiful, a string of poetic declarations that made her heart ache with a joy she had forgotten was possible. When he slipped the simple, elegant gold band onto her finger, it felt less like a new bond and more like the sealing of something that had always been meant to be. If you're watching, please like and subscribe to the channel, and tell me in the comments where in the world you're from. But even amidst the perfect beauty of the moment, a small, discordant note played in the back of her mind. Her daughter, Chloe. Standing a few feet away, her maid of honor, Chloe was a vision in a pale blue dress, but her face was a mask of tension. Her smile was brittle, her eyes bright with an emotion that looked more like panic than joy. Laura had tried to talk to her that morning, but Chloe had been distant, evasive. "It's just nerves, Mom," she'd said. "I'm just so happy for you." But Laura knew her daughter. This was not happiness. This was a barely suppressed storm. She had assumed it was the lingering, complex emotions of seeing her mother, the woman who had been her sole parent for so long, give her heart to another man. She had decided to give her space, confident that the joy of the day would eventually win her over. During the reception, held on a wide, flagstone terrace overlooking a serene lily pond, Laura allowed herself to be swept up in the celebration. She laughed with friends, accepted heartfelt congratulations, and danced with her new husband under a canopy of twinkling fairy lights. For a few blissful hours, she let the small worry about Chloe fade. David was attentive, adoring, his hand always finding its way to the small of her back, his eyes rarely leaving her face. He was everything her first husband had not been: present, engaged, openly affectionate. With him, she felt seen. It was after the cake had been cut, as the sky deepened to a velvety indigo, that the storm finally broke. Chloe appeared at her side, her face pale in the soft glow of the lanterns. "Mom, can I talk to you for a second?" she asked, her voice low and tight. Laura, feeling the champagne buzz and the warmth of the perfect day, smiled and allowed her daughter to lead her away from the music and laughter toward a quiet, secluded bench at the edge of the garden. "What is it, sweetheart?" Laura asked, concern finally breaking through her happy fog. "Are you feeling all right?" Chloe didn't answer right away. She stood before her mother, wringing her hands, her breath coming in short, ragged gasps. Then she looked up. Her eyes, so like her father's, were filled with a decade's worth of unshed tears and a new, terrifying fury. She began, her voice a choked whisper. "I can't let you do this. I'm sorry. I should have said something sooner, but I was scared. I can't let you be married to him." Laura stared at her, utterly bewildered. "To David." "Chloe, what are you talking about? You love David." "No," Chloe said, shaking her head, the movement sharp, violent. "I don't. I hate him, and you should too." She took a shuddering breath. "A few months ago, when you and David hosted that dinner for his university colleague, I recognized him. Not from the university, from somewhere else. He didn't remember me, but I remembered him. It took me weeks to place it, to be sure. He was the doctor, the one in the emergency room. The night Dad died, the world, which had been a warm, spinning blur of champagne and roses, came to a sudden, sickening halt. Laura felt the blood drain from her face. The memory of that night, a memory she had so carefully packed away in the darkest corner of her mind, came rushing back with brutal clarity. The screech of tires, the shattering glass, the chaotic, impersonal horror of the hospital emergency room. Her first husband, Chloe's father, had been in a car accident. Chloe, a teenager at the time, had been in the passenger seat and had escaped with only minor injuries. He had not been so lucky. "Chloe," Laura said, her voice trembling, "it was a terrible night. It was chaos. You were in shock. You can't possibly— I can, Chloe insisted, her voice rising with a desperate, hysterical edge. I remember everything. Dad wasn't dead when we got there, Mom. He was hurt, he was scared, but he was talking to me. They put him in a bed, in a little curtained-off area, bed 3. And then David came. He was the doctor. He was so young. He looked at Dad's chart, and then he walked away. I followed him, and I heard him. I heard him talking to a nurse. Chloe's eyes locked onto Laura's, and the words she spoke next landed with the force of a physical blow. If you're watching, please like and subscribe to the channel, and tell me in the comments where in the world you're from, he said. Don't worry about the patient in bed 3. He's got no chance. We need the resources elsewhere. And then he walked away. He never came back. He didn't even try. He just let him die. The beautiful, fragrant garden around them seemed to dissolve, replaced by the sterile, antiseptic smell of a hospital, the sounds of happy music replaced by the frantic beeping of monitors, and the quiet, desperate sobs of a teenage girl who had just watched her father die. The man she had just married, the man who had promised to love and cherish her, was, according to her own daughter, the man who had let her first husband die. Her wedding day had just become the scene of a horrifying, impossible accusation. The joyous melody of the string quartet seemed to mock Laura as she stood frozen on the garden path, Chloe's words hanging in the air like a poisonous fog. David, the man she had just pledged her life to, the man whose kindness had coaxed her heart out of its long, protective hibernation, was now a potential monster, a negligent doctor who had let her first husband die. The accusation was so monstrous, so utterly at odds with the man she knew, that her mind recoiled from it. Chloe, that can't be right, Laura whispered, her voice hollow. You were a child. You were traumatized. The mind plays tricks in moments like that. It wasn't a trick, Chloe insisted, her voice raw with the pain of a memory she had clearly replayed 1,000 times. I saw him, Mom. I heard him. Why would I make that up? Laura had no answer. She looked at her daughter's anguished face and saw not malice, but a deep, unhealed wound. Chloe had never truly recovered from her father's death. She had been a quiet, somber teenager who had grown into a guarded, serious young woman. Laura had always attributed it to the trauma of the accident itself, but now she saw it was something more, a secret that had been festering for over a decade. David, noticing their prolonged absence, came looking for them. He approached with a smile, his face handsome and open in the soft lantern light. Everything all right, my loves? He asked, his gaze moving from Laura's pale face to Chloe's tear-streaked one. At the sight of him, Chloe physically flinched, taking a step back as if he were a leper. I can't, she stammered, before turning and fleeing back towards the main house, leaving Laura and David alone in a sudden, heavy silence. What was that about? David asked, his smile fading, replaced by a look of genuine concern and confusion. Laura couldn't bring herself to repeat the accusation. It felt too grotesque, too insane to say aloud on her wedding night. She's just emotional, she managed to say, the lie tasting like ash in her mouth. It's been a long day. The rest of the night was a waking nightmare. Laura went through the motions, smiling, thanking guests, even dancing one last stiff dance with her new husband. But his touch, which had felt so warm and safe only hours before, now felt alien. Every time she looked at him, she saw not the literature professor with the kind eyes, but a younger man in a white coat, walking away from a dying patient. Could it be true? Was the man she loved capable of such cold, callous negligence? Or was her daughter, in her grief, projecting her anger onto a convenient target? The question was a schism that split her world in two. On one side was her love for David, her belief in his fundamental goodness. On the other was her fierce, protective love for her daughter and the undeniable reality of Chloe's lifelong pain. She was trapped between the two people she loved most in the world, caught in an impossible, agonizing dilemma. The next few weeks were a study in strained politeness. They were officially husband and wife, living under the same roof, but a chasm had opened between them. David, sensing her emotional withdrawal but having no context for it, grew increasingly anxious and solicitous. He brought her flowers, made her favorite meals, suggested romantic weekend trips. His kindness was a form of torture, each gesture a fresh reminder of Chloe's accusation. Was this all an act? Was this charming, attentive man a mask, hiding a cold, indifferent core? Laura, meanwhile, was torn. She couldn't bring herself to confront David directly. What if Chloe was wrong? The accusation would destroy him, and their new marriage for nothing. But what if she was right? How could she live with, sleep next to, the man who had played a role in her first husband's death. The silence between them grew heavier each day. The beautiful new chapter she had been so excited to write was already stained with a terrible, unreadable blot of ink. She knew she couldn't live in this limbo. She had to know the truth. But pursuing it meant risking the destruction of everything she held dear: her daughter's trust, her new husband's love, and her own fragile, hard-won happiness. If you're watching, please like and subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where in the world you're from. One rainy afternoon, sitting alone in the quiet of her home, Laura made a decision. She could no longer live with the ghost of her daughter's accusation. She picked up the phone and made a call, not to a lawyer, not yet, but to a discreet, expensive private investigator, a man who specialized in cold cases and, more specifically, in medical negligence. "I have a sensitive matter I need you to look into," she said, her voice low and steady. "It concerns an incident at Philadelphia General Hospital, a little over 10 years ago." She had made her choice. She had chosen the truth, whatever the cost. The investigator, a quiet, methodical man named Frank Miller, began his work with a frustrating lack of progress. 10 years was a long time. Memories fade, records are archived, and people move on. Frank confirmed the basics easily enough. On the night of the accident, David, then a second-year resident, had indeed been on duty in the emergency room. Chloe's father, Richard, had been admitted and had died a few hours later. The official cause of death was listed as cardiac arrest secondary to massive internal bleeding from a ruptured spleen. On paper, it was a tragic but straightforward case. Frank's initial interviews were dead ends. The attending physician from that night was now retired and living in Florida, with no specific memory of one patient among the hundreds he had seen that year. The other nurses on the shift had scattered, their married names and new locations difficult to trace. The hospital's official records were sterile and unhelpful, detailing only times of admission, vital signs, and time of death. There was no mention of a decision to withhold treatment, no note that would corroborate Chloe's story. "It's her word against his, Laura," Frank said to her one afternoon over coffee. "A traumatized teenager's memory versus the official record and a doctor with a spotless career. In a legal sense, we have nothing." But Laura couldn't let it go. Chloe's conviction had been too absolute, her pain too real. Laura pushed Frank to dig deeper. "There was a nurse," she insisted. "Chloe heard him talking to a nurse. We have to find her." Meanwhile, Laura's life with David had settled into a strange, cold routine. They shared a bed, but they were miles apart. David, sensing her impenetrable wall, had stopped trying to break through it. He was now quiet, watchful, his earlier warmth replaced by a palpable sadness and confusion. The easy intimacy they had shared was gone, replaced by a tense, polite cohabitation. He clearly believed she was having second thoughts about their marriage, that she had made a mistake, and his quiet dignity in the face of her perceived rejection was, in its own way, heartbreaking. Laura found herself in the bizarre position of feeling a deep sympathy for the man she was secretly investigating. The strain was taking its toll on her relationship with Chloe as well. Chloe, who had unburdened herself of her secret, now expected action. "Have you confronted him yet, Mom?" she would ask in their daily phone calls, her voice sharp with impatience. "What are you waiting for?" "These things take time, Chloe," Laura would say, her voice weary. "I need more than just your memory. I need proof." "So you don't believe me," Chloe would snap, and the familiar, painful cycle of argument and recrimination would begin again. Laura was losing both her daughter and her husband, caught in the crossfire of a war that was being fought entirely in the shadows of the past. The breakthrough, when it came, was small, almost insignificant. Frank, through a painstaking process of cross-referencing old hospital staff lists with social media, had found a possible match for the nurse. Her name was Maria Flores. She had left Philadelphia General a year after the accident, had gotten married, and now, under the name Maria Peterson, was working as a school nurse at an elementary school in a quiet suburb of Baltimore. "It's a long shot," Frank warned Laura. "She may not remember a single night from 10 years ago, and even if she does, she may not be willing to talk." But it was more than Laura had had before. It was a thread. She drove to Baltimore herself, without telling David or Chloe where she was going. She found the elementary school, a cheerful brick building surrounded by a playground. She waited in her car until the end of the school day. When Maria Peterson emerged, a woman in her late 30s with a kind, tired face, Laura approached her. "Excuse me, are you Maria Peterson? Did you used to be Maria Flores?" Laura asked, her heart pounding. The woman looked at her, her expression wary. "Yes. Who's asking?" "My name is Laura Collins," Laura said, using her maiden name. "You were a nurse at Philadelphia General about 10 years ago. I need to ask you about a night you worked there. A night there was a car accident, and a man named Richard Collins was brought in. At the mention of the name, Maria's friendly face changed. A shadow passed over her eyes, a flicker of a memory she had clearly tried to forget. I don't remember, she said, her voice suddenly guarded. She started to walk away. Laura's heart sank, but she couldn't give up. Please, she said, her voice pleading. His daughter was there. She was a teenager. She remembers you. She remembers you and the resident on duty. A Dr. David Martin. Maria stopped dead in her track. She turned around slowly, her face pale. She looked not at Laura, but past her, her eyes focused on a memory. The night of the bus crash, she whispered, her voice barely audible. Oh my God, I remember that night. And I remember the patient in bed 3. She finally looked at Laura, her eyes filled with a deep, profound pity. You shouldn't be digging this up. Some things are better left buried. Maria Peterson was hesitant to talk. The memory of that night was clearly a traumatic one, a scar she had no desire to revisit. But there was something in Laura's eyes, a desperate, pleading need for the truth that she couldn't turn away from. She agreed to meet Laura for coffee at a small, anonymous diner off the highway. In the quiet of a back booth, over the clatter of plates and the low hum of conversation, Maria began to speak. And the story she told was not the simple tale of negligence Chloe had described. It was a story of chaos, of impossible choices, of a night that had been, for the young staff of the ER, a descent into hell. It wasn't just a car accident, Maria began, her hands wrapped around her coffee cup as if for warmth. Your husband and daughter were among the first to arrive, but minutes after them, the first ambulance from the bus crash came in. She looked at Laura, her eyes dark. It was a tour bus, filled with high school students on their way back from a band competition. It had overturned on the interstate. There were so many injuries, so many kids. Her voice dropped to a near whisper as she described the scene. The ER, which was already busy, was instantly overwhelmed. Every bed was filled. Patients were on gurneys in the hallways, and the sound of crying, of screaming, of the frantic beeping of monitors was a constant, deafening roar. They had enacted a mass casualty protocol, but they simply didn't have the staff, the resources, the blood supply to handle the sheer volume of trauma. We were all in over our heads, she said. The attending physician was in surgery with a critical patient. That left the residents in charge of the floor. And David, Dr. Martin, he was the senior resident on duty. He was so young, barely out of med school, and suddenly, he was the commander of a battlefield. She described David not as the cold, indifferent doctor Chloe remembered, but as a terrified young man, his face pale and sweat-soaked, running from patient to patient, trying to make impossible, life-or-death decisions every few seconds. He was doing the work of 5 doctors, Maria said. He was trying to triage, to figure out who could be saved and who couldn't. It was brutal. It was war. Then, she got to the part Laura had been dreading. I remember your husband, she said softly. The patient in bed 3. He came in conscious, talking. His vitals were stable at first. On any other night, he would have been an immediate priority. But that night, he was a low priority tag, a green tag. We had so many red tags, so many critical injuries, so many children. Her voice trailed off, and then something happened. His blood pressure started to drop rapidly. He was bleeding internally, much worse than anyone had realized. She looked at Laura, her expression pained. And there was something else, a note in his chart, a rare blood disorder, hemophilia or something like it. I don't remember the exact name, but I remember what it meant. He couldn't clot properly. A normal internal bleed for him was a potential death sentence. This was a detail Laura had forgotten, a part of her late husband's medical history that had been a minor inconvenience in his life, but was now, in retrospect, a critical, fatal detail. David, Dr. Martin, he saw the note. Maria continued. I was with him, and I saw his face. It was, I'll never forget it. It was the face of a man who had just been given an impossible choice. She took a shaky breath. At that exact moment, a call came from the pediatric trauma bay. A little girl, one of the band kids, had gone into cardiac arrest. She was O negative, and we had 1 bag of O negative blood left in the entire ER. The pieces of the puzzle clicked into place in Laura's mind with a horrifying, sickening clarity. Your husband needed that blood, Maria said, her voice cracking. But this little girl was actively dying right now. David had to choose. He looked at me, and he said the words your daughter heard. Don't worry about bed 3. He's got no chance. It wasn't callousness, Mrs. Collins. It was a battlefield calculation. He believed that even with the blood, your husband's chances, given his clotting disorder, were slim. The little girl's chances, if she got the blood immediately, were better. So he made the choice. He sent the last bag of blood to the pediatric bay. He chose to save the child. Maria started to cry, quiet, racking sobs. He saved her life. The little girl survived. I saw her name in the paper a few weeks later. But your husband, he arrested a few minutes later, and we didn't have the resources to bring him back. David never went back to the curtain. I think he couldn't bear to see what he had done. It wasn't negligence. It was triage. The most awful, terrible kind. The story was finished. Chloe hadn't been wrong. She had heard what she thought she heard, but she had heard it without the context, the horrifying, impossible context of a war zone. David was not a monster. He was a young soldier who had been forced to leave a man behind to die in order to save someone else. The secret Chloe had been carrying was not a secret of malice, but of a profound shared trauma that had shaped two lives in ways Laura was only just beginning to understand. Laura drove back to Philadelphia in a daze, Maria's words echoing in her head. The story was both a relief and a new, more complex kind of pain. David was not the villain her daughter had painted him to be. He was a victim of circumstance, a young doctor scarred by a decision no one should ever have to make. The weight of the accusation lifted, but it was replaced by the heavy, sorrowful truth of a tragedy that had more than one victim. The secret she now carried was different, but no less volatile. How could she tell Chloe? How could she explain to her daughter that the simple narrative of blame she had clung to for a decade was a lie, that her father's death was not the result of callous indifference, but of a brutal, cold, battlefield calculation? To Chloe, David was the man who had let her father die. To tell her he had done it to save a child might not bring her peace. It might only complicate her grief, forcing her to confront the terrible, random cruelty of the universe, a truth far harder to bear than simple blame. And what about David? He was living with his own secret, the memory of that night locked away. He clearly had no idea that the woman he had fallen in love with and married was the widow of the man he had been forced to sacrifice. The irony was of a cosmic, almost literary cruelty, something a literature professor like him might appreciate if it weren't his own life. To confront him with the truth would be to reopen a wound he had been living with for 10 years, to connect his greatest professional trauma with his greatest personal happiness. It could shatter him. For a few days, Laura did nothing. She existed in a state of suspended animation, caught between two secrets, two people she loved, terrified that any move she made would cause irreparable harm. Her coldness toward David softened, replaced by a deep, aching compassion. She found herself watching him when he didn't know she was looking, seeing the faint, lingering sadness in his eyes that she had previously attributed to a scholarly melancholy. Now she saw it for what it was, a haunting. Her new compassion, however, only confused David further. Her sudden warmth, after weeks of chilly distance, seemed to give him hope. He tried to bridge the gap between them, reaching for her hand, suggesting they talk about what was wrong, and she would pull away, unable to speak the truth, her silence a new kind of cruelty. The breaking point came one evening, a week after her trip to Baltimore. They were sitting in the living room, reading in a silence that was thick with unspoken words. David finally put his book down. "Laura," he said, his voice quiet but firm, "I can't do this anymore. This silence, this distance. I love you, but I feel like I'm married to a ghost. If you regret marrying me, if you've made a mistake, please, just tell me. The uncertainty is killing me." She looked at him, at this good, kind man who was suffering because of a secret he didn't even know she possessed, and she knew she couldn't protect him from the truth any longer. Their marriage, if it was to have any chance at all, had to be built on a foundation of honesty, no matter how painful. "I don't regret marrying you, David," she said, her voice trembling, "but I know what happened. 10 years ago, at the hospital," the color drained from his face. His book slipped from his lap and fell to the floor with a soft thud. He stared at her, his eyes wide with a mixture of shock, confusion, and a dawning, horrified comprehension. What are you talking about?" he stammered, but his face told her he knew exactly what she was talking about. "My first husband," Laura said, the words feeling like stones in her mouth. "His name was Richard Collins. He was brought into your ER after a car accident. He was in bed 3. David made a small, choked sound, a sound of pure, unadulterated anguish. He looked at her as if he were seeing a ghost, the ghost of a past he had tried so desperately to outrun. The secret he had carried alone for a decade had just walked into his living room and sat down across from him. There was nowhere left to run. The confession, when it came, was not a torrent, but a slow, painful trickle of words, extracted from a well of trauma that David had kept sealed for a decade. He sat opposite Laura, his body hunched, his hands clasped so tightly his knuckles were white. He looked not like a respected professor, but like the terrified young resident he had been that night. He recounted the story just as Maria had, but from his own, deeply personal perspective. He spoke of the overwhelming chaos, the sheer number of bodies, the smell of blood and fear. He described the feeling of utter inadequacy, of being a young doctor with a textbook full of knowledge and none of the experience to handle a war zone. I was triaging, he said, his voice a low, hoarse whisper. Just trying to put my finger in the dam, trying to stop the flood. I was going from patient to patient, making snap judgments based on a few seconds of assessment. Who was critical? Who could wait? Who was already gone? He described coming to bed 3, seeing Richard. He was talking, David said, his eyes unfocused, lost in the memory. He was scared, but he was conscious. His vitals were stable. I put a green tag on him. In my mind, he was the lucky one. He was going to make it. And then he described the moment of the impossible choice. The call from the pediatric bay about the little girl in cardiac arrest. The simultaneous call from the nurse about Richard's dropping blood pressure and his clotting disorder. The knowledge that there was only one bag of O-negative blood left. It wasn't even a decision, really, he said, his voice filled with self-loathing. It was an algorithm, a cold, brutal calculation. A dying child with a chance versus a dying man with almost no chance. I'm a doctor. We're trained to save the most salvageable. So I made the call. He looked at Laura, his eyes swimming with tears. I sent the blood to the little girl, and in doing so, I sentenced your husband to death. I knew what I was doing. I knew the consequence. He buried his face in his hand. I never went back to his bed. I couldn't face him. I couldn't face the daughter I knew was waiting just outside the curtain. I heard later that he had arrested. I just kept working. I saved 3 other people that night, and I killed your husband. The word killed hung in the air between them, a stark, ugly, and honest admission. Laura listened, her own heart aching, not with anger, but with a profound, overwhelming empathy. She was not listening to a monster. She was listening to a good man who had been shattered by the weight of a single, terrible moment. You didn't kill him, David, she said softly. The accident killed him. The chaos killed him. You made the only choice you could. Did I? He asked, looking up at her, his face a mess of grief and guilt. I've asked myself that question every day for 10 years. Could I have done more? Could I have split the blood? Could I have fought harder? Maybe, but I didn't. I made a choice, and a man died. A girl lost her father, and you lost your husband. He shook his head. And now, in some kind of sick cosmic joke, you've married me. You've married the man who... He couldn't finish the sentence. Laura moved from her chair and knelt on the floor in front of him, taking his cold, trembling hands in her. David, she said, her voice firm, compelling him to meet her eyes. I know something you don't. I have a secret of my own. And then she told him. She told him about Chloe, about the words she had overheard, about the secret she had carried, about the hatred she had nurtured for a faceless, nameless doctor for 10 years. She explained that their marriage, for the past few months, had been a lie, that she had been investigating him, that she had found the nurse, that she knew the whole story. It was her own confession, a confession of her own deception. They were 2 people, bound together by a shared, terrible secret, a secret that had almost destroyed them before they even knew what it was. They stayed up all night, talking for the first time with a raw, painful, and absolute honesty. They talked about Richard, about the man he had been. They talked about the little girl whose life had been saved. They talked about the weight of secrets and the corrosive power of guilt. By the time the sun came up, the chasm between them had closed, but they were not the same 2 people who had gotten married in a sun-drenched rose garden. The easy, joyful love they had felt was gone. In its place was something deeper, more complex, and perhaps more resilient. A love forged not in the light, but in a shared, painful darkness. They had survived the truth. But now they faced an even more difficult challenge. They had to tell Chloe. Telling Chloe was one of the hardest things Laura had ever had to do. She asked her daughter to meet her for lunch at a small, neutral cafe, a place with no memories attached. She didn't bring David. This was a conversation that had to happen between a mother and a daughter, a conversation that was a decade overdue. Chloe arrived on the defensive, her arms crossed, her expression guarded. She had been growing increasingly frustrated with Laura's inaction, and she was clearly expecting another prevarication. So, have you finally decided to leave him? She asked before Laura could even speak. No, Chloe, Laura said gently. I'm not leaving him, but I did what you asked. I found out the truth. Laura began to recount the story Maria, the nurse, had told her. She spoke of the bus crash, the chaotic ER, the impossible choices. She tried to paint the picture of the war zone, of the terrified young doctor at its center, but Chloe wasn't listening with an open heart. She was listening for confirmation of the story she had been telling herself for 10 years. As Laura spoke, Chloe's expression hardened, her jaw tightening. So you're making excuses for him, she said, her voice flat and cold. when Laura finished. "I'm not making excuses," Laura said, trying to keep her own voice steady. "I'm giving you the context, the reality of the situation. It wasn't a simple case of him not caring. It was a choice between your father and a dying child. And he chose the child," Chloe snapped, her voice rising. "He decided my father's life wasn't worth as much. He decided my life, my future without a father, wasn't worth as much. How is that better, Mom? How does that make it okay?" "It doesn't make it okay," Laura said, her heart aching for her daughter's pain. "Nothing can make it okay. Your father is gone." "But it wasn't an act of malice, Chloe. It was a tragedy." "It was a choice," Chloe insisted, her hands clenched into fists on the table. "And he chose to let him die. And you chose to marry him. You chose the man who killed Dad over your own daughter." The accusation, so raw and so unfair, felt like another slap in the face. "That's not true, and you know it," Laura said, her own voice beginning to rise. "I didn't know who he was when I married him. And now that I know the truth, the real complicated truth, I am trying to find a way to live with it, to forgive. Not just him, but the whole terrible situation." "Forgive?" Chloe laughed, a bitter, ugly sound. "I will never forgive him, and I don't think I can forgive you for asking me to. You've made your choice, Mom. You chose him, so have a happy life." She stood up abruptly, her chair scraping loudly against the floor. She threw a $20 bill on the table. "For my coffee," she said, her voice dripping with scorn. And then she walked out, leaving Laura alone at the table, the chasm between them wider and deeper than ever. Laura had hoped the truth would be a bridge. Instead, it had become a wall. Chloe was clinging to her anger, to the simple, clean narrative of blame, because it was easier than confronting the messy, painful, random nature of tragedy. She needed a villain, and David, and now Laura herself, had been cast in that role. The weeks that followed were a painful silence. Chloe refused to answer Laura's calls or texts. She had cut her mother out of her life as cleanly and cruelly as a surgeon's scalpel. Laura was adrift, caught in a terrible limbo. She had found a new, deeper honesty with her husband, but in doing so, she had lost her daughter. David, seeing her pain, was consumed with his own guilt. "This is my fault," he said one night, as Laura sat staring blankly at the wall. "I brought this into your life. I destroyed your family." "No," Laura said, her voice weary. "A bus crash on the interstate destroyed my family. A rare blood disorder destroyed my family. You were just the last tragic piece of the puzzle." But she knew it wasn't that simple. She knew that unless Chloe could find a way to move past her rage, their family would remain broken, and she had no idea how to help her daughter do that. The truth hadn't been enough. She needed something more. But what? Laura was at a loss. Her relationship with Chloe was completely fractured, and her marriage to David, while honest, was shadowed by the pain they had caused. David was consumed with guilt, and Laura was consumed with a feeling of helpless sorrow. She felt like she was failing everyone she loved. It was Frank Miller, the private investigator, who offered a new, unexpected path. He called her a few weeks after Chloe had cut her off. "I know you said the case was closed," he said, his voice hesitant, "but something was bothering me. The nurse's story, the bus crash, it was all very compelling. But I'm a man who likes paper. I like proof." He explained that he had continued digging, filing a series of Freedom of Information Act requests with the hospital and the city. Most had been denied or had come back with heavily redacted documents, but one had, through a bureaucratic fluke, yielded something extraordinary. "A clerk in the hospital archives found it," he said. "It was misfiled. It's an unofficial after-action report written by the ER's attending physician the day after the crash. It was an internal document, never meant to see the light of day. It details every decision, every patient, every loss from that night. I have a copy. I think you need to see it." Laura met him at his office, her heart pounding with a mixture of hope and dread. The report was a thick, dry, clinical document filled with medical jargon, but it was also a harrowing, minute-by-minute account of the chaos of that night. It detailed the names and ages of the victims, the severity of their injuries, the desperate, heroic efforts of the staff, and then she found it. A section on triage decisions. The attending physician, who had been in surgery for most of the night, had reviewed every major call his residents had made. "Triage decision for patient Richard Collins, bed 3, the report read. Dr. Martin faced an untenable choice between Mr. Collins, a 42-year-old male with a known coagulopathy and massive internal bleeding, and patient Jane Doe, later identified as Sarah Bell, 8-year-old female, an O-negative pediatric patient in cardiac arrest. Given the resources available at the time, 1 unit O-negative PRBCs, Dr. Martin made the difficult but correct call to allocate the unit to the pediatric patient, who had a significantly higher probability of survival, while the loss of Mr. E. Collins is a profound tragedy. Dr. Martin's decision, under extreme duress, was in accordance with established mass casualty triage protocols and, in all likelihood, saved the life of the child. It was there, in black and white, the cold, brutal, and official validation of David's story. It wasn't just his memory or a nurse's memory. It was the clinical, unimpeachable truth, documented at the time by his superior. He had made the correct call. A horrible, tragic, but medically sound and ethically defensible call. But the report contained one more stunning detail. It included the outcome of the other patient. Sarah Bell, 8, was successfully resuscitated and, after a lengthy recovery, was discharged. She is alive and well today. The report even included her parents' contact information at the time. Laura stared at the page, her mind reeling. The little girl, she had survived. There was a life, a whole life, that had been lived because of the choice David had made. This was it. This was the piece that was missing. It was not just a story about loss. It was also a story about salvation. Chloe had only ever been able to see what had been taken from her. She had never been able to see what had been given to someone else in its place. Laura knew, with a sudden, absolute clarity, what she had to do. She couldn't force Chloe to forgive, but she could force her to see the whole truth, not just the painful fragment she had been clutching for a decade. She took a copy of the report, folded it, and put it in her purse. It felt as heavy as a stone. This document could either be the weapon that finally destroyed her family or the key that finally set them all free. Laura didn't call Chloe. She knew a phone call would be too easy to ignore. Instead, she drove to her daughter's apartment, the after-action report in her purse. She stood outside the door for a long time, gathering her courage, before she knocked. Chloe opened the door, her face a mask of cold surprise. "What are you doing here, Mom?" "I need you to listen to me, Chloe," Laura said, her voice quiet but firm. 5 minutes, that's all I ask. After that, if you still want me to leave, I will, and I won't bother you again." Reluctantly, Chloe let her in. The apartment was neat, orderly, but it felt cold, unlived in. Laura's heart ached for the lonely life her daughter had built for herself, a life walled in by a decade of anger. They sat in the living room, a palpable distance between them. Laura didn't try to make small talk. She simply took the report out of her purse and placed it on the coffee table between them. "I know you don't believe me," Laura began. "I know you think I am making excuses for David, so I'm not going to talk anymore. I'm going to let the truth speak for itself." She pushed the report towards her daughter. "This is an internal report from the hospital, written the day after the accident. It was never meant to be seen by the public. I want you to read it, especially the section I've highlighted." Chloe looked at the document with suspicion, but her curiosity got the better of her. She picked it up and began to read. Laura watched her daughter's face as she processed the words. She saw the initial skepticism, the flicker of confusion, and then, as she read the clinical, detached description of the impossible choice David had faced, she saw the first cracks appear in the armor of her anger. Her jaw unclenched. Her shoulders, which had been rigid with tension, began to slump. But it was the final sentences that broke her, the part that detailed the outcome of the other patient. "Sarah Bell, 8, was successfully resuscitated. She is alive and well today." Chloe looked up from the report, her eyes wide, filled not with anger, but with a profound, stunned silence. The simple, black-and-white narrative of her father's death, the one that had defined her life, had just been irrevocably complicated. Her father had died, yes, but a child had lived. It wasn't a story of a hero and a villain anymore. It was a story of a terrible cosmic equation. A life for a life. "She lived?" Chloe whispered, the words barely audible. "Yes," Laura said softly. "She lived." For the first time in years, the anger in Chloe's eyes was replaced by something else, a deep, shattering wave of grief, raw and unfiltered. The anger had been a shield, protecting her from the true, random horror of what had happened. Without it, she was just a girl whose father had died. She began to cry. Not the angry, frustrated tears Laura had seen so often, but deep, heaving, heartbroken sobs. It was the grief of a teenager, a grief she had never allowed herself to feel, that had been poisoned and twisted into rage for a decade. Laura moved across the room and sat next to her daughter on the sofa. She didn't say a word. She simply wrapped her arms around her, holding her as she cried, rocking her gently, just as she had when Chloe was a little girl. It was not a moment of forgiveness. It was not a moment of easy resolution. It was a moment of shared, painful truth. The secret that had been a wall between them for so long had finally, tragically, become a bridge. They were just a mother and a daughter, grieving together for a man they had both loved and for a past they could never get back. 6 months later, Laura and David stood in the Rose Garden at the Philadelphia Botanical Garden. It was a crisp autumn day, the air smelling of dry leaves and the last faint perfume of the late blooming flowers. It was the same spot where they had been married, a place that now held a complex tapestry of memories, the joy of their union, the horror of Chloe's revelation, and the painful, honest reconstruction of their love. Their marriage had survived, but it was different now. The easy, sun-drenched happiness of their courtship had been replaced by something quieter, deeper, and more resilient. They were not a perfect couple from a storybook. They were two people with scars, with a shared, tragic history, who had made the conscious, difficult choice to face the darkness together and build a life in its aftermath. The love between them was no longer just an emotion. It was a daily act of will, of forgiveness, of profound compassion. A little way down the path, Chloe stood, watching them. Her relationship with Laura was slowly, tentatively healing. The anger was gone, replaced by a quiet, shared sorrow. Her relationship with David, however, was still a fragile, uncertain thing. She had met with him once, at Laura's gentle urging. The meeting had been short, awkward, and filled with long silences. There were no apologies, no accusations. She had simply looked at him and said, "My mother told me what happened. I understand." It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was a beginning, a cessation of hostilities, a truce. Laura and David were not tending to the roses. They were there to plant something new. In a small, specially prepared plot of earth, they were planting a sapling. It was a ginkgo biloba, a tree known for its incredible resilience, its unique beauty, and its status as a living fossil, a species that has survived for millions of years. It was Laura's choice, a landscape architect's metaphor for what she hoped their love and their family would become. Something that could endure, something that could survive the cataclysms of the past and continue to grow. As they worked, tamping the soil around the base of the small tree, Chloe took a few hesitant steps toward them. She stopped at the edge of the flower bed, her hands in her pocket. "What kind of tree is that?" she asked, her voice quiet. "It's a ginkgo," Laura said, looking up at her daughter with a small, hopeful smile. "They're survivors." David looked at Chloe, his own expression one of quiet, humble hope. He did not say anything. He simply offered her the small watering can he was holding. For a long moment, Chloe just stood there. Then, slowly, she reached out and took it. She walked to the small sapling and gently, carefully, began to water it. The three of them stood there in the quiet of the garden, a mother, a daughter, and a husband, united in the simple, hopeful act of nurturing a new life. The garden of their family, which had been poisoned by secrets and scorched by anger, was finally being replanted. The scars of the past would always be there, a part of the soil, a part of their history, but they were no longer just a source of pain. They were the foundation from which something new, something stronger, something more honest could finally grow. Thank you very much for watching. Share with those who also like stories, subscribe, and tell me in the comments if you liked my story. Cheers.